We have been talking about this refrigerator since last week. Cooling, we've talked about how do we find out where the leak was, which is we came down to troubleshooting this and found out that it was leaking Freon. So, the last thing we did is we isolated it. How many different sections did we separate the sealed system when we were checking for leaks? Just put it on my desk. I know exactly what it is. I'll take care of it. No, right there on the table. Thank you.
Thank you.
So how many different sections? Didn't we break up each component in different sections while we were testing for leaks?
Was it 3?
It was 3. Do you remember what those 3 items were?
I wasn't
You didn't watch the video? So the 3 were the condenser, the hot gas loop, which was the pipe here, and the pipe over there, which was what ran through the cabinet, and then the low side of the system. And we pressurized all 3 of them to 100 PSI, and that's what this little line is. So we put the pressure, but even though they both don't look the same here, they're both saying 100, it's just that the scale on one and the other are not the same. So 100 doesn't line up exactly the same on both. One will be here and one will be there when it says 100. So what we did is we separated each section, we put valves on it, and we charged it with nitrogen to 100 PSI, and we let it sit overnight to see which one of those 3 the pressure dropped, indicated that that was the part that was leaking. And when we did that, we identified the hot gas loop as the part that was leaking. So we said, okay, that is the one tube in this whole entire system that we really can't repair. That tube is running through the cabinet, around the door of the freezer, and comes back through the cabinet the other side. It's inside the insulation here. You cannot get to it. You'd have to destroy the whole fridge just to find the pipe. So what we said is we're gonna bypass that pipe. And this is how we bypassed it here. This condenser here went to another pipe right here. If you can, I can bend it out a little bit. Right here is the hot gas loop. So this condenser went right to the hot gas loop, and it came out over here, and that was supposed to go to the dryer filter. So when we said the hot gas loop was leaking, we removed the hot gas loop from the system. And so instead of the condenser going to this pipe, the condenser went right to the filter and went to our capillary tube. So he went ahead and connected everything together and determined that he had created a restriction. He was adding Freon. What did we do with that pipe? Did I keep that? I think I kept that little piece too on the desk.
Top drawer, I think, maybe.
I don't think I have top drawer, but it's, let me see if I can find that pipe for a second.
Definitely kept it.
I kept it because I wanted to keep it for show and tell. Well,
Yeah.
I'll find it
It's
after
plugged
I'm
up,
done
though.
lecturing and show it to you. So, after he had bypassed it, he had connected everything up like you see it, and this line right here, he put too much solder and completely restricted it. So when he was charging it, that line is what line? Was it the high side line or the suction line?
Suction line.
Okay, high side is also known as the discharge, which is this black one. That's the suction line. So when he was adding Freon, that Freon was coming in to the condenser, but the problem is that the suction side where the compressor was pulling in. Remember, compressor is just like a water pump. One side it pushes, the other side it pulls in. But if I don't have the side that's pulling in, the Freon's not going around through the system. So when he was checking his low side, he wasn't getting the pressures he was supposed to. It kept pulling down into a vacuum. Now this is why he's pulling into a vacuum. Both this line and this line go into the compressor, okay? So if I add Freon here, it goes right to the high side, but it stops right at this pipe. It doesn't go back up this way. So as he keeps adding Freon, it's going into the condenser, but it's not really filling up the low side of the system. Even though some of it will go around, it wasn't really filling up the low side of the system. So we first thought that the restriction was here at the capillary tube. He took that apart, cleaned it up, fixed it up, redid it. But when we did it, I had told him to do what? What was it that I asked you to do? Because we had a restriction. We didn't know where the restriction was. What did you do to try to find out where the restriction was?
He would glue nitrogen through both the side and low side of the system.
Yes. He had some pipes. He went again to 100 PSI nitrogen. Why do we keep saying 100 PSI? Why do we keep harping on that number? What's important about that 100 PSI? Okay. Well, what's important is 100 PSI is, first of all, when we run this system, we have something called a high side and a low side on our gauges. So the high side pressure goes up to 125, and the low side pressure, which is like at 60 or 70 when it's off, drops to about 0 when it's running. That's normal pressure, 0, 125. So if you're trying to find a leak, there's a couple ways we could do it. We could use our little soap bubbles, and we can put soap on fittings and see if they're leaking. We have an electronic leak detector, which will beep if it finds Freon. But when the refrigerator is running, it's pulling the pressure down to 0 PSI. You would have no pressure on your pipes at 0 PSI, so trying to find a leak while the system's running, your low side of the system is not gonna have any pressure to create a leak, okay? Or it could even be worse, if it's low enough, it goes a little bit below 0, now it's sucking air into your system instead of Freon coming out. So, going back to what I said, why do we say 100 PSI, is on the refrigerator, you know what, let me just bring up a picture on the computer. I'm gonna go into my software for a second. I'm gonna show you guys something here. Let me, I'm gonna pull up a model and serial number plate for you guys to look at. Just give me 1 second, see if I can find a refrigerator call here. Hopefully this guy took a picture of the model and serial number plate. Okay, so this is the model serial number plate off a refrigerator. And this is what I want you guys to pay attention to. It says designer, S, and actually you don't see it there, but that's LS. What's HS and LS?
High side, low side.
High side, low side refrigerant system. Remember, compressors pumping Freon into some pipes which are high pressure, we call that the high side. And the Freon comes around back to the other side. We got high side here, low side here. Okay? So it says design pressure 300 PSI, low side pressure is 140 PSI. So they're saying everything on the high side could take 300 pounds of pressure. Everything on the low side can only take a maximum of 140 PSI. Why is the low side different than the high side?
Make it equal.
This is usually made out of copper or steel. Usually condensers are steel on refrigerators. What is my evaporator made out of?
Aluminum.
Aluminum. So aluminum doesn't have the tensile strength of metal that steel does, so you can't put that higher pressure. If you go too high a pressure, that aluminum will break. Okay? So you're like, okay, well I can check the high side with 300, I can only check the low side with 140. So can I just put 300 on the high side and 140 on the low side? Why not?
The pressure should be relatively equal.
It's gonna be equal. Why? Just like this picture here that I'm working on here. Oh wait, that's, sorry, I'm in the server and I'm not in the, not in the,
Your phone.
here. It's just like this. The only thing I haven't done yet is this copper pipe. I'm gonna run another one to the compressor. Your refrigerant system is one system. Even though this steel condenser can handle 300 pounds of pressure, if I put nitrogen in here, it's gonna be the whole system, whatever I pressurize it at. So we just pick 100, because some aren't even as high as 140 on the low side, they're about 120 on the low side. So we don't wanna go over 100 PSI, but if I put 100 PSI, the whole system is at 100. So that way, if there's a leak, we can tell. We don't need to run the compressor to check for leaks. That pressure will cause leaks out and pressurize the whole system. When it's off, it's only 70 PSI on the low side. When it's on, it's only 0. So by putting 100 nitrogen, it pressurizes the whole system higher than it would normally be on the low side. So if it is leaking from there, we can find it. Okay? So what we did is we put 100 PSI nitrogen in there, and we cut the capillary tube next. This cap tube right here, we cut it. Why did we cut the capillary tube?
Because we want to see what side the nitrogen is releasing from, once it's basically released. If one side is still coming out, then we know that it's not that side that's plugged up. The other side would be plugged up.
Yeah, so in other words, the 100 PSI was to test to see if there's any leaks. But in this case, what I was talking about before is we realized as we were adding Freon, it wasn't that there was a leak at this time, but both sides' pressures weren't what they were supposed to be. The low side, instead of being at 0 when it was running, kept going into a vacuum lower than normal, which means we need to add more Freon to bring the pressure up. But as we kept adding Freon, this side would go up, but this side wasn't doing it. So what we did is we pressurized the whole system with 100 PSI nitrogen. Then we cut the cap tube right about here, away from the dryer filter, and we want to see if the nitrogen is coming out of both ends of the capillary tube. Because if it comes out of one end and not the other end, that is our indication that our restriction is either high side or low side. Now, we didn't have that problem when we first started working on it, so then it came back to, okay, what did we do from the first time we touched this machine till now, which was we bypassed that loop and we rebrazed all these lines back onto the compressor. So that's where we came down to, hey, the restriction has to be right here on the suction line. Instead of him using a torch to pull it apart, I had him cut the pipe. The braze joint was here, I had him cut both pipes so that we took that braze joint out. Why did I have him cut it out and not use a torch to pull it up?
Because we didn't want the brazing of the solder to possibly run into the compressor.
That could happen and it really wouldn't hurt it because it would just fall into the bottom of the compressor. But if we used a torch to pull the pipe out, that restriction might cause the solder that's in there to melt, and we'll never see the restriction and confirm to ourselves that was our problem. Plus, with that much solder in there, it would be better to cut it out and start fresh than try to get the solder out of the pipe and try to fix it. Now, I do have a video, a real short video I did, has a picture of 2 compressors because Gene, another one of the guys in the class, was working on a refrigerator and he restricted the line on the compressor, but not the suction, the discharge. And the video shows how I turned the compressor on and let it blow pressure and blew the solder right out of the pipe. But this is the suction side. If I turn the compressor on, what would it do? It'd suck the solder into the pipe. So cutting it out allowed us to see, and we physically saw the restriction. I'll show you all in a minute, I'll find that pipe. We physically saw the restriction where the Freon wasn't able to pass through. So now he fixed that restriction, pulled a vacuum on the system, and recharged it. Now, one thing he did not do when pulling a vacuum is when we pull a vacuum, the gauge here can only go to a 30-inch vacuum, okay? What should we do when we're pulling a vacuum? We should use something else while we are evacuating to tell us how deep the vacuum is.
So a micron gauge?
A micron gauge, very good, you're starting to catch on. A micron gauge is a digital gauge that it has thermistors in it. We've talked about thermistors before, I'm not gonna go over them too much now. But as it pulls a deep vacuum, the thermistor tells the micron gauge how deep it is. when we get to 30" here, it's really 29.9. From 29.9 to 30, there's still, even though on a gauge it looks that small, we go into microns, which is such a small, minute measurement, that we're at like 2,500 microns, we gotta pull down to almost 500 microns. When we pull down to 500 microns, that means there's almost no moisture or non-condensables that are in our system. Okay? The reason why I brought up microns is he did not evacuate with a micron gauge. It's not his fault. He did not evacuate with a micron gauge because if he used a micron gauge, the refrigerator would never have gotten down to 500 microns. Why? Because after he did the vacuum like he was supposed to, he evacuated it, and he charged it properly, it wasn't cooling well. He had a little more freedom. And then he came back the next day, or actually from last week to this week, and it's supposed to be running at 0. It was running at 10 inches of a vacuum. So what happened? It was running at 0, which was what that pressure's supposed to be when it's running. But now it was 10 inches in a vacuum. Why did that happen? What would cause something like that?
A leak.
A leak, possibly a restriction. And it's not a restriction like the last one where he brazed and clogged it, but some oil could have gone in the capillary tube, but it's not likely because we put a brand new filter on there. But a leak would cause both pressures to be lower than normal. Now, when you had this connected over the weekend, did you have both the high and the low side connected to the fridge?
No, I did not have the low side connect, the high side connect, sorry.
You didn't have the high side connected, so we saw a 10-inch vacuum. But we didn't know if it was a restriction or a leak. The only way I could tell it was a leak is that if I saw the pressure on the high side was also lower than it's supposed to be. Okay? So I told him, hey, you need to connect this back. We need to see what's going on. And sure enough, instead of it being at 120, it was about 100 or 90, and it was a 10-inch vacuum. That means both gauges were lower than normal. That immediately is an indication, hey, we're losing freon. Now, to his credit, with all the work he did, he soap tested, because when you braze all these pipes back together before you evacuate and put gas in, we pressurize it with nitrogen at that time, and we soap test all our fittings to see if any of them are leaking before we charge the system back with gas. Okay? So what did we do? We pressurized the nitrogen, we soap test everything, and it didn't indicate a leak. So he charged it. We came back this week, we see both gauges are low, we still have a leak. Now, going back to what the first thing I said is we broke it up into 3 separate sections. We pressurized the condenser here. We pressurized the evaporator from these 2 pipes. Now, on this system, there was another pipe that went up around the refrigerator door and came back and went this way. It didn't go here. This is how it looks now, went straight to the, but there was another pipe going to the cabinet. So we isolated this with 2 valves, we isolated this with 2 valves, and we isolated this with 2 valves. And this one, the pressure did not drop. So we knew that this one, the pressure dropped, that pipe is the pipe that's leaking. Okay? So that's why we just said, okay, well, we're just gonna remove that pipe and go straight from the condenser into here, removing that pipe that's bad. Now he's charged it up and we still have a leak. Now, we pressurized these 2 and they sat for a day or 2 without leaking. So if we have a leak now, where most likely would our leak be? If we pressurized these and they didn't leak.
So you did all 3 of those?
We originally pressurized all 3 from the beginning
Yeah.
and didn't identify a leak. But we did see that this one out of the three leaked. So these two didn't leak. Only that Yoder loop or hot gas loop leaked.
Yeah,
We bypassed it now,
yeah.
but we still have a leak now, but we know that these two held pressure.
So it's the compressor or the dryer filter?
Not necessarily compressor dryer filter, but what did we do to test for leaks? We disconnected this pipe, we disconnected this pipe, this pipe, this pipe, we disconnected this pipe, and this pipe that's coming down, we disconnected all those pipes. We had to rebraze all of them back into the refrigerator. Now we have a leak. So most likely the leak that is currently in that refrigerator was created when he brazed, one of those did not seal properly. One, we could try to sand and rebraze all of them, or we could remove them, cut them out, and start fresh and rebraze them. It's up to him which way he wants to attack it. But if you had a leak on one of those braze joints, it's very possible that the pipe could be leak, it could be dirty, or it could have like oil or something that caused the leak. And if you try to go over it with a torch and try to like sand, put more solder and you know, seal it up, if it's dirty, it might not ever stop the leak. And it was my learning over a period of time that when we have a leak in a system, we don't want to like sit there with a torch and just keep trying to seal it, just keep trying to seal it. You're gonna create a restriction, or you're just gonna be wasting your time, because if it leaked, it was dirty, it's never gonna stick to solder. The only way to fix it is to remove that pipe, remove the braze joint, cut both out, and just start fresh and make sure that your pipes are clean and ready to go. You're a welder, you know.
Yeah.
If you try to weld and your pipe is got oil on it or dirty,
You're gonna
how,
crack.
how good's your weld gonna be?
It's gonna crack.
It's gonna crack. And it's the same thing with brazing. The compressor has oil in it, the refrigerant passes through the system and carries a little bit of that oil. So when you're working on it, some of that oil gets on your pipes. So when you're working on these refrigerators, you're doing this brazing, you need to take the time and make sure that every braze joint you do is clean. And I let you all do the other day, you all took turns brazing and practicing just to do it. But that's pipe that's on the table or on the bench, it's not actually real live in the refrigerator. You'll get that opportunity when you get into refrigeration. But you have to know, take that extra minute or two prepping your braze joints, because at the end, the job is easier. If you don't take that time and you have a leak, now you're spending more time going back. Now what would have happened to him is he would have did the repair and charged the customer's refrigerator Freon, and he would have checked it and everything seemed to be working good. What would happen? We get a recall. Customer called back the next day, maybe not even the next day because it lost pressure, but may not have lost enough pressure for the customer to notice a cooling loss. It might take up to 3 to 5 days, and now the customer called me, got a cooling loss. I had a call from a technician today. He said, hey, I got this LG refrigerator, and it's given me, let me see if I can tell you what the code is. The code is, let's see here. The code is FDH. And here's what the instruction, this is what he Googled and sent to me. It says, is particular to units with a dual evaporator. What does it mean, dual evaporator? They fight each other, like they duel? What does dual evaporator mean?
Two evaporators.
Yeah, but more specific, two evaporators what? Where are the two evaporators?
There must be two.
One for the
There must
fridge
be a
and
freezer.
one for the freezer.
One for the refrigerator compartment and one for the freezer. Now, here's the thing. Manufacturers do them all differently. I got a Samsung refrigerator that has dual evap, but the two evaporators are what they call them series. They're always carrying Freon when the compressors run. Most manufacturers use a step valve which sends the Freon to the freezer or to the refrigerator, cools that compartment down to temp, and then goes to the other compartment. Now it goes back and forth maintaining temperatures. Just think here, you got a dual evaporator, and you go in and out your refrigerator all day, you never open up your freezer. Well, that refrigerator may come on, but only run long enough to cool the fridge side down, not the freezer. But this unit only has a single evap, so they have like a little damper, a little window that it cools the freezer, and they just let some of that cold air down into the fridge. So going back to what it says, listen closely. These particular units with a dual evaporator refer specifically to the evaporator in the freezer compartment. So already the code is telling you a problem with the evaporator freezer compartment. There's more. This error indicates that 80 minutes have passed since defrost. But the defrost sensor is not over 40 degrees. Now, with a mechanical refrigerator, we have a mechanical thermostat, we have a mechanical, let me pull this away from the wall here. We have a mechanical bimetal or defrost thermostat here. Okay, and this is on the suction line, the line returning back to the compressor. When the refrigerator is running and the freon's flowing through here, this evaporator is running 15 degrees below zero. And when that gets cold enough, which is about 38, 18 degrees, they're all different. When it gets cold enough, that thermostat will close, and that is for a heating element that's running down here. You can't really see it with this piece here, but there's a heating element running down here. And that is to defrost the ice that builds up here so it's properly cool. And every once in a while, we gotta melt that ice. But on the one that I'm telling you about, instead of a mechanical thermostat, it has a sensor, a thermistor that goes in that location, a defrost thermistor. Now, what the complaint said, I'm gonna read it to you one more time. The complaint says, this error indicates that 80 minutes have passed since defrost. What does that mean? What is it telling me?
It's cycled out, it's cycled out.
What does that mean? Because some people might not know what you're talking about.
I mean, so it's, after defrost, it's supposed to cycle through freezing and then possibly back into a defrost.
Okay, no, defrost, even on these mechanical timer ones, this is, I don't know what a mechanical timer was that was here, but it's not here now. A mechanical timer is usually here it is. Every 8 hours, this timer shuts off the compressor and turns on that heater for 20 minutes. Melts the ice, goes back into cooling. So it's 8 hours before it goes defrost again. Now, computer boards are even more, and you can watch the videos that I have about that. I'm not gonna go into it. But going back to this, they're saying that it went into defrost. Now it went into cooling. It's been running and cooling for 80 minutes now, which is an hour and 20 minutes. Okay? And it said, after 80 minutes has passed, the sensor here is not over 40 degrees. Now, first of all, on that refrigerator, where is this evaporator?
In the freezer.
In the freezer. What temperature do we want a freezer to be?
Freezing.
Zero.
22.
0 to 10
0 to
degrees.
10.
What's the temperature of the evaporator with the refrigerant inside?
You say it was negative 15 or something?
Minus 15 degrees. So at 0 psi, this tube is running 15 degrees below zero. What you're saying is this thing's been running for 80 minutes, and that sensor has yet to reach 40 degrees. So I was talking to my tech, and I said, well, if the sensor was bad, it wouldn't identify it, would it? But what other thing would have caused it? The refrigerant problem, right? If it don't have enough freon, it'll never get cold enough. So I told him, the guy says this or that. So he called me back. He says, Richard, I think it's a bad sensor. But then I asked him, I said, okay, but how's the freezer itself? Is the freezer cold? Because if the customer has ice in the freezer, it's getting below 40, and the sensor or the board's bad. But he says, no, the freezer's not cooling either. The fridge is fine, but the freezer's not cooling. But he says, I got 0 psi. I said, yeah, but 0 PSI on the refrigerator evaporator. In a dual evap system, refrigerator evaporator is only this big. A freezer evaporator is this big. So you could be low on Freon and have enough Freon for that small evaporator. But as soon as the valve says, no, go to the other evaporator, now I'm going to an evaporator this big instead of this big. And I don't have enough Freon.
Not enough.
And if I don't have Freon, I'm not gonna cool the fridge, and I'm not gonna reach temperatures. And then I find out from the guy after all that last week, he did a sealed system job. So, started off thinking, oh, I got an air code, I got an electrical problem. But it was a sealed system problem that got into that. And it was a leak, just like we're talking about today. But these new refrigerators now that use a thermistor or sensor here, use that on purpose. I went to Encompass on Monday, and I was talking about this because Brandon and I were doing a little lecture, and I brought it up there. We were talking about GE fridge, and I said, listen, some of these manufacturers, that thermistor, they use that thermistor to let them know if the Freon is properly charged. Because if the unit's running within so many minutes of the compressor running, the temperature should be cold enough for that thermistor. The board will know, hey, we didn't reach temperature. We have a sealed system problem. We have a Freon problem because the tubing never got cold enough. Now, if the compressor didn't run, obviously that would happen too. But he's saying the fridge is cooling. It's the same compressor. So the point is, leaks can be caused by many different things. But there are different things we have to look for, and we have to read that error code and understand what it's saying. Because he started off thinking it's an electrical problem, when it's a sealed system problem. And this one here, going back to this one, was yesterday, I told him to put 100 PSI on both sides and let it sit overnight. So he put them both to 100, and I said, put tape and put a line where the needle was last night, so that you would know if we lost leak, that the needle, the line and needle, if the needle lost Freon, it dropped, but the line's here, you know physically that it dropped. Now my partner, Brother B there, he likes the digital gauges because if it says 100 PSI, if it drops, you could come back the next day or whatever, and you'll see it's 99, 97, or that's fine. You could do whatever works for you. This is how I do it. I'm old school. I don't worry about batteries or nothing. I hook it up and I'm done. So here, you see the line, but look at that needle. Does it look like that needle's on that line, Jerry Joseph? Is that needle on that line? So did it look like it dropped? So we're still losing pressure. So he has a leak on this system. So his next step is either try to fix each brace joint or
Replace.
remove every single one of them and do it over. Look, in a customer's house, I don't want you cutting out every single joint and redoing every single joint. But here we're in school, let's cut them all out and let's just redo them to get it done right, so we have the practice doing it right. It's very possible that his leak is somewhere on the high side, only because some of them are copper to steel, the dryer filter and at the compressor. And when you're doing with the similar metals and you're doing with that steel, if that steel ain't clean enough, it's gonna leak, and it can be such a small leak. Because right now, he's soap tested it more than once, and he used an electronic leak detector. He is unable to find a leak in the system. Now, we did not have a leak when we had the restriction, but we don't know if it even leaked on that side because it wasn't properly working. So that's where we are on this system right now to date, is that now he's got to remove that charge and figure out what his next step is to fix what we have here. Does anybody have any questions about this and the system and everything else? Yes, sir.
Something that always intrigued me, this thing.
That's called a dryer filter or filter dryer. It's got a bunch of little balls inside of it, and when the Freon is flowing around, it filters the Freon, because you know, like outside we got humidity and moisture. if we get that inside the system, it could cause a problem. So those little balls inside that filter absorb that moisture so that it doesn't flow around the system. Because if it gets inside this little, look how big this tube is, or this tube, look how skinny that tube is. So imagine inside how small it is. I get one drop of oil or one drop of moisture in there, and it'll block the refrigerant from flowing through, and we lose cooling. So anytime we work on a system, we repair this, we have to change this and put a new filter in there. Because if we reuse the old one, it may have moisture that gets back into the system, or it may have oil in it that can contaminate our system. So anytime we service what we call the sealed system, always want to change a dry filter. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Good. Anybody else have any other questions? No? Okay, shop work. Lizzie, I think I'm gonna ask if I can get that recording. of
Sure,
yours and
you
see
know
how
you can-
good it is.
Not a problem.